overcame their differences to end the Cold War. Professor Miles, good morning.
Good morning to you, Greg. Good morning, everyone.
We'll start with President Biden. He visited Ukraine earlier this week in what US officials called an unprecedented event. How significant was it, and do you think it can make any difference to the current trajectory of the war?
Well, I think President Biden's visit to Kyiv was enormously significant. First of all, it was significant on a strictly symbolic basis. And, in international politics, symbols matter. And the President of the United States arriving in what is certainly still rightly considered a war zone, and not a war zone in which American troops are fighting like Afghanistan or Iraq, where many presidents before President Biden have made trips, was a real boost. I'm hearing this from friends and colleagues in Kyiv and elsewhere in Ukraine, to Ukrainian morale, a really public demonstration that the United States stands with them. It was also a pretty clear act of defiance against Vladimir Putin, who has driven his country into further and further depths of pariah status, to show that the United States and Joe Biden himself is uncowed by Russia's current war in Ukraine, that the president won't let Vladimir Putin dictate where he does and doesn't go and what he will and will not make a foreign policy priority. The last point that I think is really important, Greg, is that Joe Biden did not come to Ukraine empty-handed. He came with some $500 million worth of further aid pledges, including some very sophisticated technical weaponry. But as much as people get really excited talking about sophisticated tanks and things like that, he also pledged more artillery rounds and barrels, replacement barrels, that are really the backbone of what is enabling the Ukrainian military right now to fend off the Russian invasion.
Apologies, I was muted there when I was following up with Professor Simon Miles. My bad. Busy morning. Thank you very much for that. Those opening comments. You mentioned the symbolism earlier of President Biden's visit. I'm wondering if you could speak to the aid package that you mentioned. How much of that is symbolic, and how much of it is actually a significant contribution to the Ukrainian war effort?
Oh, none of that is symbolic. This is not the early days when there were, frankly, pretty risible statements like the German government donating 500 helmets to the Ukrainian war effort. This is lethal munitions and the critical supplies to back them. And that's what Ukraine needs to stay in this fight and ultimately drive the Russian invasion off of Ukrainian territory. These are long-range missiles. These are infantry fighting vehicles. These are artillery shells. This is very much exactly what Ukraine needs. Look, I've done a few of these with you, Greg, and I've said, I think, every time that the Biden administration has not been as fast as they ought to be in providing aid. I've said that about the Trump administration. I said that about the Obama administration beforehand, because Ukraine has been facing a very clear existential threat since 2014 and even before that, from its neighbor, the Russian Federation. We now see exactly what that means and what that looks like in practice. So fortunately, the Biden administration, and to be fair, a lot of important players in the legislative branch as well, are continuing the provision of aid. It's not everything that could be done, especially in terms of long-range precision strike weapons, which would be a huge boon to the Ukrainian war effort, perhaps even starting to look into the area of aircraft provision. But it is an important and not just symbolic contribution to Ukraine's ability to continue to defend itself.
Absolutely. Thank you. You mentioned also that President Biden's visit was clearly intended to send a message to Moscow. We saw that Vladimir Putin made some remarks also. What did you kind of take from them? Did that give us any kind of updated sense of how the Russian leadership is seeing this conflict?
Well, Vladimir Putin returned to playing his old worn-out record. A little bit of talking about the war, and then very quickly descending into bizarre conspiracy theories about the sort of the atheistic depravity of the West, and all kinds of sort of bizarre culture war, Trojan horses. It's really when I listened to Vladimir Putin's speech earlier today, a huge proportion of it could have kind of been from any speech that he gives, including, frankly, in 2023, bizarre shout outs to the grain harvest, which is a metric that I think no other advanced nation in the world really makes a big point of public policy addresses. He made certain comments about the war effort, trying to inflate this into an existential struggle for Russia, trying to make claims with really no evidence whatsoever, because there is none, about Russia having been forced to invade its neighbor to preempt something worse. What that worse thing is something Vladimir Putin has always been pretty vague about. Because there is no there. So when Vladimir Putin took to the podium today, all you had to do, I think the most telling thing was to look at his audience, which was all of the key players in his inner circle, his cabinet, key figures in Russian politics, and just how extraordinarily unenthusiastic every single person in that room looked. You look at someone like Elvira Nabiullina, who's the governor of the central bank, a very competent technocrat. She is the China shop owner to the bull of Vladimir Putin's imperialist fantasies, who gets to clean up the mess that he's making right now. It's an open secret that she has been opposed to the war from the get-go, but she and everyone else in the audience, absolutely no enthusiasm for this war effort, which they know is in the process of ruining their country and also their own fortunes.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it's interesting you say that, because we had a very similar conversation last year about a similar Putin appearance and a lack of enthusiasm from a lot of his top advisors. And the sense then was that he was far too entrenched in power for that to actually make a difference. Do you have a sense that the fact that this is having a very negative impact on Russia is in any way shaking the Russian people's faith in their leader, or even the people around him, whether there's any potential for any kind of change of power in the country as a result of this?
Well, in his speech today, Putin claimed that the country is 100% behind the war effort, and that it has sort of risen up in a quasi-religious patriotism to take the fight to the Ukrainian menace, again, whatever that means. This is patently not the case. Russia is an extraordinarily repressive state in which any show of dissent or disagreement with the government, especially on the issue of the war in Ukraine, which is and isn't still being called totally misleadingly a special military operation by the Kremlin, is extraordinarily dangerous. But I think all you have to do is look at things like the rise in flight ticket prices out of Russia, the quantity of Russian citizens who have decamped to places like Serbia, the United Arab Emirates, and elsewhere, to get a pretty clear picture that, especially amongst more elevated, more educated, more upwardly mobile figures in Russian society who have options, they are voting with their feet, Greg, and they're leaving Russia to try to make their fortunes wherever they can in order to avoid either being conscripted into the war effort or simply seeing their lives and their quality of life dragged down by the continued prosecution of this conflict.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And staying on the topic of the effect on Russia, the UK Defence Ministry and some others have said that, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, said that Russia probably lacks the reserves to increase the scale or intensity of its offensives this winter in Ukraine. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think that is a fair assessment, Greg. We've seen probably for the last, let's say, 4 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, the beginnings of a renewed offensive in Russia, which coincides with the change in leadership from Sergei Surovikin at the head of the Russian war effort to now his boss, Valery Gerasimov, who's also the professional head of the Russian military. Surovikin's main effort was focused on, let's say, trying to stop the bleeding from the really reckless abandon with which Russia launched its war effort, with a concept of operations almost entirely predicated on prejudice and gross miscalculations about the Ukrainians' ability and willingness to resist. That wasn't enough for Vladimir Putin. And I know we've talked before about how the Kremlin, and particularly the president, has micromanaged this war. And so he has goaded his military leaders into what I think we're seeing already is a really premature offensive concentrated on about a half a dozen axes of advance in the Donbass. They don't have the reserves to do much more than that. They have a small reserve in waiting to try to exploit any breakthroughs, which they may or may not be able to make in this effort. But beyond that, the Russian force structure has just not been built up to really exploit any opportunities to a great extent. And moreover, force quality is a huge problem. You're talking about mobilized, conscripted troops with very little training, pretty shoddy equipment now because most of their best equipment was destroyed in February and March of last year. That's not really the force that you want if you're going to go and try to prosecute a big offensive, try to open up a big hole in the Ukrainian defensive lines. That's not a recipe for success. And in the Russian populace, there's really no appetite for joining up to participate in this war. So if they are to try to generate more forces, they're going to have to make some kind of second major mobilization wave. There is a sort of an ongoing mobilization in the country. We talk a lot about waves, but there is a sort of a steady effort to get people, whether they like it or not, into uniform. That's going to be, again, reliant on coercion, not on any sense of volunteerism or patriotism.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Just like to remind everybody, we are open to questions. You can post questions in the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, you can raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you when your turn comes around. I'd like to come back to the anniversary this Friday. As I started to say earlier, the UK Defence Ministry has said that Russia will claim some sort of victory, to align with the anniversary, regardless of the reality on the ground. Do you think if that happens that it's just posturing, or is there more to it?
It's possible that by Friday, the Russians will be in a position militarily, for example, to claim that they have taken, or I'm sure they'll say something absurd like liberated, a place like Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Bakhmut is not really much of a prize. It's also become the object not only of a Russia versus Ukraine fight, but also of a Russian military, that is to say Russian defense ministry versus Russian private military company, primarily the so-called Wagner group led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. It's also the locus of a fight between those factions within the Russian system. And so any kind of claims of victory is going to set off just as much internecine squabbling as it does alarm bells anywhere. In fact, vastly more. Look, the battlefield right now is pretty fluid. Advances in places like Vuhledar are also causing huge losses. A success in a place like Bakhmut is a totally Pyrrhic victory. The quantity of forces and expendables like artillery that have been poured into Bakhmut in order to attain a strategically not all that valuable objective are far outweighed. And so, yes, I'm sure that just like 4 whole provinces of Ukraine were quote unquote annexed by Russia in the past, the Kremlin very well might try to claim some kind of symbolic, but probably ultimately meaningless victory in order to try to make some sense of approximately 200,000 casualties that they've sustained in Ukraine to date.
Absolutely. Thank you. That is a massive number. Looking back at when the invasion was launched, one of the big concerns across Eastern Europe was that Russia might have its eyes on other countries and expanding its borders in that direction. Does the manner in which Russia has gotten bogged down in a longer than expected conflict in Ukraine, has that eased those concerns in Eastern Europe, or are they still very much alive?
Well, Greg, as you know, I was in neighboring Romania when the war broke out in February, or rather, I should say, when the Russian invasion, which had been ongoing since 2014, was reinvigorated in February. And certainly there was a moment of concern, at least as I experienced it there in Bucharest, Romania. But very rapidly, after a day or two, this diminished quite significantly. It was pretty clear to everyone, I think, that the NATO Article 5 security guarantee was something that Vladimir Putin would not be interested in entangling with. And now, after we've seen about a year of the Russian military's performance on the battlefield, I think we can also say it's not really something that the Russian military could tangle with. It's certainly fair to say, and this is an important caveat, that the way the Russians are fighting Ukraine is not how they envision, nor probably how they would fight a NATO enemy. But all the same, we've seen such huge systemic rot uncovered in the Russian military and also in the Russian political system, such that I think that when someone like Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the murderous dictator of the Russian region of Chechnya, talks about Poland being next, I think most serious people simply roll their eyes.
Absolutely. Thank you. The question, obviously, that everybody wonders and nobody can fully answer is how this conflict ultimately ends, what the resolution is. Is your impression, based on the extent to which Russia has gotten bogged down here, is that they are clinging on for some peaceful resolution in which they get to claim some part of Ukraine? Do you still think that's the most likely outcome, or is it even worth speculating at this point on how this thing winds up?
Well, as I said just a few minutes ago, I think the situation right now is extremely fluid. The Russians would have been much better served to have tried to wait out a Ukrainian offensive as opposed to launching their own, hoping, and this is not a pipe dream, that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would sense that in order to keep the flow of foreign aid going, he needed to show that he could do something with it and that he would be the first mover and that the Russians could then counterattack against a tired Ukrainian force. In actual fact, the opposite is going to happen. And I think that the current Russian offensive is quite underwhelming, whereas the Ukrainian offensive, which will either come with significant new Western kit at their disposal, or will come with the confidence of knowing that that kit is coming to backfill losses, could prove quite decisive in terms of what the battlefield looks like. At this juncture, the Russian military has no hope of another push on Kyiv or anything along those lines. Holding on to territory in the east and to a lesser extent the south is the pretty paltry best that they can hope to do. The Ukrainian population and certainly political and military leadership have shown no predisposition towards any kind of negotiated settlement which cedes any of Ukraine's borders as Russia recognized them in 1991 to the Kremlin. And at this point, I think it's certainly very premature for American or other policymakers to try to goad them into taking that approach. That being said, we know that wars tend to end in negotiations. Terminating a war is rarely a clean, precise undertaking. And so certainly, it's wise to start thinking about that next phase, albeit in a position where the Ukrainians clearly have military superiority and the Russians continue to be on the back foot.
Absolutely. Thank you. One of the kind of variables here that people are increasingly focusing on is the role of China. There have been kind of visits and discussions, it seems, between Russian and Chinese leaders, and there is talk that there is potential for China to provide Russia with military support. I mean, how likely do you think that is at this point, since it could, if it happened, cause the US and China to be in something of a proxy war in the region?
Well, let me just start by saying, what an extraordinary circumstance where the United States is in a proxy war with someone, hypothetically speaking, and Russia is the proxy, not the puppeteer, not pulling the strings. What a change, for example, from the Cold War and conflicts in places like Angola, Vietnam, where that was happening with the Soviet Union. That, I think, just the idea of that speaks volumes about how far Russia's stature on the international stage has plummeted, especially in the last year, thanks largely to the efforts of its president. But let me get back to the original question, which has to do with Chinese military support for Russia. So I think it's pretty clear that there was a conversation at the most recent Olympics between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, where Putin gave Xi a sense of what was coming militarily, probably an almost entirely misleading one. He probably led the Chinese president to believe that this was going to be narrowly confined to consolidating and expanding already existing Russian incursions into Ukraine and the Donbass. And of course, that's not what the Russians quite foolishly tried to do in early 2022. In response to this, under the aegis of the so-called limitless partnership between Moscow and Beijing, the Chinese provided field rations for Russian troops, and that's about it. I don't think the Chinese government has much appetite to get involved and to tie themselves politically to what seems to be quite clearly a failing war effort. I don't think the Chinese military has much appetite to deplete their stocks in order to bolster those of an erstwhile partner and ally. And I don't think that really Chinese policymakers are very interested in running the experiment on whether their own equipment will fail as frequently and as catastrophically as the Russians, because that would significantly undermine the credibility of any threat that they might hope to pose to the United States and its partners and allies in Asia, first and foremost, of course, Taiwan. We've seen Russian missiles are failing, precision-guided missiles are failing at a rate of 50 to 60%, which is catastrophically high. And were I a Chinese general, I would be asking really tough questions about the actual quality of my gear, about the actual competency of my also largely conscript army. And I would not be looking for opportunities to test those hypotheses in a way that the entire world will be watching, and where I get dragged down with the Russians as this war continues.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. As we look to the months to come, this thing has gone on for a year, but we've seen as in Russia and US engagements in Afghanistan, these things can drag out for an extremely long time. Given that you've said that it doesn't appear Russia has the resources to go on the offensive more, as we look to the next few months, are we looking at a holding pattern where essentially Russia is just looking to hold the territory it has and just keep Ukraine under pressure? Or would you expect any major moves from either side in the weeks or months to come?
Well, I think the current Russian offensive, it remains to be seen how much success they're able to achieve. They are hamstrung by what looks to be the pretty strict rationing of artillery, which for an army built on artillery, built on fires, is a real problem for how they hope to fight. And also extremely low force quality, making their ability to take and hold terrain on the offensive really very questionable. So I think the Russians will continue to press this offensive, not because it makes military strategic sense, but rather because political leadership at the top, i.e. Vladimir Putin, is insisting on it, is basically just getting impatient and wants a win. In the wake of that, I would expect that the Ukrainian military, on whatever timeline they think is sensible, will try to exploit that weakened and exhausted Russian force and try to make some gains of their own. We've certainly seen, I think, the theater of combat narrow down to the east and to a lesser extent the south in Ukraine, where the Russians are digging in physically to try to hold their defensive lines. So we'll see what happens with this offensive, with this probable counteroffensive. But certainly at this juncture, the Russians are not really in the position, both in terms of availability of manpower and equipment, but also in terms of their own kind of intellectual capacity to wage war and learn from their past successes to try to do complex combined arms operations and maneuver warfare. Look, they believed that they were going to shut the Ukrainian power grid off and break the will of the people over the course of the winter. Now, there was a little bit of help from Mother Nature. This was a pretty warm winter in Europe, but also they just showed that they couldn't do it. They didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the competencies to try to hit those types of point targets with enough frequency and force to break the Ukrainian power grid. The Ukrainians extraordinarily kept on repairing it, kept on getting it back up to speed. So I think the Russians are looking ahead to a longer phase of warfare. I would be very surprised, to be frank, if the war ended in the year 2023. Although I wouldn't be surprised if, looking back on it, we identify the decisive moments perhaps as having taken place in the year 2023.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that seems like a perfect place in which to wrap it up. So we'll leave it there. Thank you to Professor Simon Miles for sharing your expertise and opinions. If you'd like to be notified of upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well and stay informed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.